Welcome to the Quantum Bridge again. Today we have another new guest. His name is Nick, and Nick is going to be going through what's known as nudging. Now, maybe over the last few years, you might have felt nudged by the government, for example, to behave in a certain way. Personally, I told them to nudge off. However, I'm going to hand over to Casper, who will get the show started for us.
Thank you, Gary. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Quantum Bridge, as Gary so kindly said. And again, we've got Dr. Nick with us today. And we're going to kick off by allowing Nick to give a very brief overview of his background, as much or as little as you like, Nick. And then, if you wouldn't mind, touching on the context under which sort of nudging has appeared in our world and become so pervasive, and in broad strokes at least, what nudging is. So welcome, and we very much look forward to understanding a bit more about this territory.
Thanks both. I appreciate you inviting me on your podcast.
Your pleasure.
So, I'm Nick Keca. I have a doctorate in organizational psychology, which doesn't mean too much, except I've spent probably the last 2 decades following particular threads of research that were of interest to me, and eventually wrapped it up into a doctorate. And my research interests really cover human behavior, personality, behavior change, and that really is what links us to nudging and how we got here today. Simply because nudging is essentially intended to change behaviors or direct behaviors in a certain way to a predetermined outcome.
And in terms of nudging, Nick, is it wrapped up in other subcategories or an overarching category that people may already be aware of or not aware of? What is its genesis?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I want to separate 2 things here, and everybody will know and immediately recognize what I'm talking about, and that is nudging per se has been around forever, simply because what we mean by nudging is really something called persuasion. Right, and of course, people in power, going back millennia, have wanted to be better persuaders in order to increase the people, the number of people that are following them. And nudging, in the context of this discussion, probably came about, from some of the work by. Sorry, I'm having a brain blank here. Some of the work done by
there's the Thaler and Sunstein.
Complete. It's been a long day.
No.
Yeah, Thaler and Sunstein, and there are others. For example, Robert Cialdini, David Halpin's, better known for the Behavioural Insights Unit within the UK. But all of them are, kind of working on the thread. So if you look at nudging as an academic subject, it really came from an academic subject called behavioral economics,
right?
And that was an extension from marketing, and that appeared really with Thaler and Sunstein's book in 2008. But if you think about nudging, I mean, it goes back many more decades before that. So, for example, there are cases of the city of Amsterdam in the 50s. They painted a fly into the urinals of men's restrooms, in order to guide a certain behaviour and stop people splashing around everywhere. And of course, that's a well-known brand of hygiene, porcelain. Now, there's actually a logo of a bumblebee or a fly, actually painted into that porcelain, and there are all sorts of other examples of that. But it became mainstream probably around 2008, with Barack Obama, President Obama in the US, taking an interest in different approaches rather than just legislation and laws and rules. Seeking to find other ways to guide behaviour. And within the UK, David Cameron and his cabinet started to take much more interest in nudging as a mainstream approach to public policy.
So is it allied to the area, or always to the area of coercion, which obviously also has this undercurrent of something somewhat nefarious? Or have you ever seen an example, or are there many, where actually nudging, other than stopping you from getting a substance all over parts of a lavatory that you shouldn't be, have you seen any other areas where it is used in what we might all consider to be a fairly legitimate and positive stance? Or does it tend to be only visible or invisible when it's used for a specific sort of political or ideological end?
Well, by and large, it's meant to be very subtle, and in that regard, I suppose you could say, it's largely invisible. The idea is that people still make their own decisions, but through a process of nudging, they're guided to make a decision in a particular direction, and that could be for good. For example, in terms of encouraging people to adopt healthy lifestyle or stop smoking or whatever it may be, or it could be used in more nefarious ways, as you're suggesting. And we've got to be really careful and take a balanced view about this, because it really does come down to intentions and whether they're there for the wider good or not. And then the question comes, well, who decides what's for the public good?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So a prime example of this would be, for example, some sales practices, high pressure sales practice, where the outcome of that process ends up with somebody buying something that perhaps they didn't want at all, and or didn't need. And you could argue that that's not necessarily for the good of that individual. And it really does come down to what the intentions are.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nick, we've touched on sort of that it can be used in terms of in negative ways, and probably is being. Just before we talk about other ways that we might notice it, and maybe in some way at least be able to guard against some of the maybe the darker agendas around it. In terms of sort of nudging as a whole, is it an area where it's very easy for us to immediately spot these are certain even media that are used very pervasively for nudging? I.e., is it tending to be written media? Is it very, very visual? Is it radio and so on? Where might we be most bombarded by it, and where maybe might it be less seen as well?
Well, it's used everywhere. You think of parents and their children. A parent would encourage your children using all sorts of different ways, manipulation and guile included, to encourage certain behaviours. Bribery with chocolates and sweets, or some special occasion or whatever it might be. So in that regard, it's absolutely all around us. But in the context of this conversation, of course, the media is playing a large role in this, simply because they're part of the the communication process that actually underpins it all. So is nudging being used for nefarious reasons? Well, I think absolutely it is. And if you read the the works of Thaler and Sunstein, and well, all of them actually have sections on the ethics and the concerns and challenges around the use of nudging. So from the perspective of their promotion of this as a useful technique for society, they lay out the concerns, and of course they're suggesting that this is a force for good. but the concerns are, a lack of transparency, and I think we've all seen that in the last 2 or 3 years, for example, with the way that COVID lockdowns have been communicated, and some of the manipulations that have taken place there, the potential for abusing this as a process. I mean, there's no question whatsoever that it's effective. If we look at the UK, what we essentially saw happen over a period of a couple of years is that 60 million people with really barely a protest. That there were some protests, but not really. Accepted relatively willingly. A massive loss of freedoms, and all of that started with 3 weeks to flatten the curve. And several years later, we were still flattening the curve and taking ever more draconian measures. So there is the potential for abuse. There's questions over the effectiveness of this, and it really comes down to how the tools and techniques are being used, and whether or not the subjects are appropriate to those tools and techniques. There's also the potential for unintended consequences from nudging, and that can have fairly profound impacts. And then, of course, there's the big question about, are we really happy about the state making every decision for us, and the loss of autonomy and individual sovereignty that we experience as a result of that? There doesn't seem to be much appetite within the UK, certainly, for nanny state, but that seems to be increasingly what we're getting, and it's as a consequence of some of the use of nudging.
Nick, just to say, sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that the public, in a way, at the moment, with some of the information that's coming out, is getting a peek behind the curtain of how this nudging might work in government circles. Actually, it was in the mainstream press back in 2020 that SAGE were using these techniques. I guess back then people they had their heads in masks and things. So there is a reveal, if you like. We're getting to see some of it with the WhatsApp messages now, like I say, and then the behavioural method of something like SAGE, which is more behavioural science than maybe medical. I think, and how governments use those types of things against us, essentially.
Yeah, again, taking a balanced view, I suppose, if we want to talk about that particular example. So, in the early part of 2020, when there was a lot of uncertainty about, whether or not, there was a genuine and massive public health threat from the SARS-CoV-2 virus, you can kind of understand, that they would, the government would want to do everything that they possibly could to, protect the public as far as possible. But what's become apparent since then, with the release of the Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages and so on, is that the curtain on intentions is slowly being peeled back, and you can see, well, there was something else going on there, and that, I think, is going to leave a lot of people feeling, fairly uncomfortable, and and it's most unfortunate. You mentioned SAGE. Well, if you look at the constituents of SAGE, I think the majority of them were psychologists of one kind or another. And you'd imagine, in comparison with virologists, immunologists, geneticists, and whatever other medical experts and clinicians you would expect to be making up that advisory board.
Nick, just to say, some of the examples that sort of sprung to my mind were this sort of thing of hands, face, and space. A lot of three-word terminology was thrown at us. It's simple, it's easy to digest, and it became very much to me like mantras. more so just than messaging. It became mantras that felt very authoritarian to me. That's just how I felt about this. I felt about the whole process from the beginning feeling like that. I don't enjoy any state, whether they believe they have my best interest at heart or not, deciding how I move around, who I see, and all of those other things. So just in terms of context, do phrases and patterns reiterated both verbally, and obviously there were visuals to accompany those, not least people standing apart from themselves as they delivered these things. Does that come under nudging, or is that something slightly different?
Absolutely, it is. And there are many aspects to nudging, and there are several different modes of nudging. What you're describing, and you would have seen them certainly in government messaging, and but in all sorts of other spheres of life. This isn't purely used by governments for public policy. It's probably even more heavily used by corporates. And in one form or another. And whenever you walk through the door of a supermarket, you're instantly assaulted by a plethora of different nudging techniques, from the sense that they waft through their climate control systems, to the positioning of and layout of the store, and positioning of products on the shelves, and so on. So they're all related, but I mean, you're talking about framing, in that regard, where particular ideas and benefits are positioned in a certain way, and of course, people want simplicity, and you'll often see 3 and 4 word slogans, if you like, to capture a particular idea and make people behave in a certain way. You get similar ones at airports and train stations regarding security.
Yeah, of course. Can I just touch on another area? Maybe Gary would like to jump in after this, but there's, for me, the whole area of nudging and effectively what I would just call coercion, really, in whatever sense that is, whether that is in the corporate field, political, ideological, and so on. What I sense is that historically this has been known about and been used, and maybe it's been subliminal, and maybe we can at some point touch on that, maybe not today when we speak again, but certainly the compounding effects of new technology like machine learning, arguably AI, whatever that actually may mean, and all of the other tech that is now accelerating on this sort of exponential way that it seems to be. I would guess that one has been harnessed over this 3-year period and before, but it is somewhat worrying that as that technology learns more about us, and even on the more bio side of it, actually to do with our system, our internal system, our own chemistry and biology, and maybe actually has some interface with that nudging becomes an even more potentially worrying aspect that we might all be facing. I'm not saying that to make anybody worry about it, but I'm saying that to shine a light on it so that we can all understand what that might mean. Have you got any thoughts allied to how those other areas are emerging, and how this may in some way mesh with those?
Yeah, excuse me. Yes, I certainly do. So I think the first thing I would say is nudging isn't intended to be coercive, right? It really isn't. It's as a tool, its original intention was to help people make choices that supposedly or somebody considers are for the public good. So and there are some people that struggle with making decisions, and they appreciate guidance. So in that regard, it's probably helpful. Where we have the challenge is exactly as you say, the convergence of technologies like AI, machine learning, predictive analytics, social engineering, the combination of the mass data that will come from mass surveillance, harvesting of biometric data, and so on, is going to be very challenging for us, particularly as this tool can be used for great public good, but it can also be used, in ways that are not necessarily in the public interest, but further the interests of a much narrower, set of stakeholders, and that should be a concern to everybody. Yes, what nudging is essentially is it's a form of experimentation, right? You have an idea, you'd like to, create a policy or move people in a certain direction. And you try different things that actually encourages that. And the idea is nudging. You take very small steps that nobody's going to object to. 3 weeks to flatten the curve was a prime example of that. So nobody in the right minds at that point in time would have objected to doing what it took to flatten the curve and protect people that were vulnerable. However, if rather than 3 weeks to flatten the curve, you'd said, okay, for the next 3 years, you're not going to be able to do X, Y, or Z, and your life is going to change beyond all recognition. It's unlikely that anybody would have accepted that. So, this is about actually moving people in a general direction through a series of very small iterations that they're unlikely to object to, and then you experiment, you assess the impact. If you go too far and make too much of a change, you get resistance, which of course is not what they're trying to achieve. So the convergence of these technologies is going to make that much faster, and it'll make it much more effective, if you like. Which effective being used in inverted commas. It depends who's deciding.
Yeah. Gary, was there anything else you wanted to add? I've got one more question, but if you'd like to.
Well, just wondering, in Nick's opinion, given the last few years, do you think that they nudged, too far and too fast, and subsequently getting a backlash now?
Well, I think so, and I think the backlash will come. I mean, perhaps some people have no interest, or they're worn out from all of this, but the backlash comes from transparency that we're now getting. By the exposure of like the Hancock's WhatsApp messages, but also some fairly large media platforms, social media, podcasts like Rogan and so on, that are actually questioning question the narrative, which is something that we haven't been able to do for 2 or 3 years, without censorship and censorship. And of course, that's peeling back the layers of the onion and exposing what's underneath, and people are not seeing the public good particularly.
Yeah, that's a good one to touch on. I was just going to sort of, because I'm conscious of time, and I'm very hopeful that Nick will come back maybe a couple of times to look at again how pervasive this has been, what it might look like for us in the future, and again, not necessarily defense against it, but awareness, because I think there were, despite, and I think you probably agree with this anyway, Nick, but despite what many people say about, who would have known in the first iterations of this, like flattening the curve and those sort of things, that this was ever going to go on this long. Well, actually, I think there were quite a lot of us who would have known, but we were, as you rightly point out, Nick, almost immediately censored. Now, whether that was overtly, i.e. that there was something that was going to be incredibly draconian if you said anything, or more implied in terms of those of us who were involved in business, for example, when it was very difficult to go against that line without immediately being branded a conspiracy theorist, a nutter. Those sort of words were bandied around by our own government against anybody who was even thinking about speaking out, and they couldn't much speak out anyway. When you've got things like Speaker's Corner and police chasing people around for trying to speak their minds, and platforms like these being very difficult to utilise. I'd just like to sort of sum this up for today, at least, with your thoughts about, could this happen again, Nick? How easy would it be for governments, the powers that be, to do something like this again? Or do you think that we do have a more informed and awakened public to this type of nudging process?
Well, I think we have to accept that, you know, this is a continuous process. You know, it's, you know, this isn't something that's, you know, once and done. You know, as an experiment, I think, you know, the experiments were done a long time ago. They've been perfecting the techniques and processes. You know, whether it's in corporates or in government, you know, for public policy. And really, I think the only thing we can do, and of course, the technology, convergence of technologies is going to make it, you know, a ubiquitous, you know, process. You know, what we have to question is, you know, whether our democracy is working as it should do, and whether politicians, you know, our elected representatives are properly being held to account. But the secret here is to really raise awareness of what this is, so that you know, people understand. You know, be aware of nudging. You know, question you know, question the narrative, and that's not really been something that's been very popular. You know, dissidents are you know, frowned on these days, and even having alternative views and opinions about this or that is becoming you know, problematic as time goes by. You know, seek out alternative information. Don't rely on single sources of information. Look across a wide variety. You know, if you're getting repeated messages from all of the media platforms, I mean, that's a great signal that, you know, what you know, that we're actually being nudged about something, whether it's a war taking place in a dark corner of the world, or some other you know, some other event. You know, be skeptical. You know, I think there is a tendency. I don't know whether this is a UK thing or not, but you know, there is a tendency to you know, not challenge these days. You know, perhaps it's, you know, something that's born out of laziness. You know, we want to be spoon fed. You know,
Well,
rather than
yeah,
go
but I'm
looking
not sure
for.
about that actually, Nick, because I've felt that there's nudging on that too. There's a lot of things, particularly in the corporate world, and I just mean even as a consumer, about not being aggressive and being nice to staff and all of these things, which obviously any right-minded person will agree that
Yeah.
nobody deserves to take the brunt of another person's anger. But there does need to be an ability to voice the fact that you're dissatisfied with things. And I think it is about time that more people did that through the right channels, and that the weight of doing that could affect change, at least could. But look, on that note, I'm noticing that we're very, very close to time. Nick, I think that was a fantastic first iteration of what nudging is, how it's being used, and opens it up to actually further discussion. So provided you're happy to come back on and talk to us again and talk to our audience, we'd love to have you back again. But for now, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Bob, for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
No, it's a real pleasure. Okay,
Thanks.
so for the Quantum Bridge, over and out.